Purpose of this presentation is to bring everybody up to date on the testing and data gathering that we've been doing on the Raintree Lakes, and to explain what we've been doing and why we've been doing it, what we've been testing for, and why we're testing for that. And in order to give the background on that, I'd like to return to this explanation of what happens when lakes become eutrophic. So in an ideal situation, you have a constant inflow of nutrients into any water body. They will produce algae. The food web is there. We've got a couple of fish here to represent it, but it's everything from benthic zooplankton to zooplankton and so on in the water, crustaceans, fish, and then the land-based animals, whether they are birds or fishermen or otters or whatever it may be, that remove that biomass from the water. And that gives you a nutrient clearance mechanism, which is how the balance of nutrients and biomass and so on is maintained in a healthy water body. So what starts to go wrong, particularly once you get human settlement and the nutrient inflows increase, is you get an excessive amount of algae produced. That doesn't mean massive blooms, but algae cells only live for a matter of hours and days. So it's a bit like having a massive banquet. If there's a bit of an increase, a bit of a bloom, it doesn't have to be a massive, obvious algae bloom, but as the amount of algae goes up, there is more than the food web can consume before the excess dies off and it sinks to the bottom. When it does that, it starts to decompose and organic sediments start to build up, in which invasive weeds will grow, and this is the start of the problem. Particularly when that organic matter dies off, sinks to the bottom and decomposes, it depletes oxygen from the water at the bottom of the water body. So you start getting a deoxygenated hypoxic zone at the bottom where weeds will grow in it. But the benthic zooplankton and the animal life responsible for, at the very base levels of the food web, cannot function because they're suffocated out of there. So as the deoxygenation takes place and the organic algae cells and dead weeds annually as they die off decompose, you now have a secondary source of nutrients, because nutrients can be remobilized and recycled from that sediment, which means you have a feedback loop in place, because now you have more and more algae being consumed. More and more of the excess dies off and goes to the bottom. It accumulates there. It consumes more and more dissolved oxygen. And so you have a situation where eventually the animal life becomes constrained because it can't operate in a lot of the water because there's no oxygen. The benthic zooplankton can't operate on the sediment, which is in anoxic areas. And so your nutrient clearance is constrained. So the whole feedback nature of this gets more and more amplified because there's more and more weeds, more and more algae. And so you've got these three key things of a sediment nutrient stockpile that causes hypoxia and that recycles nutrients. And the feedback effects and the amplification of that whole problem over time just means it keeps getting worse and worse and worse, to the point where eventually you will start noticing that the animal life in the food web has disappeared or is reducing. And the whole thing becomes a problem of weeds and algae and eutrophic water body. The next thing to understand, the real risk, is toxic cyanobacteria. Now, that is a specific type of algae that is, or not of algae, it's a precursor to algae in evolutionary terms, but they are very proficient at exploiting the conditions that exist when you have a big sediment nutrient stockpile, hypoxia, and nutrient recycling. So let's just see if we can understand and explain that a little bit. So cyanobacteria have a number of competitive advantages over your normal algae. Firstly, they can hibernate, in inverted commas, in the sediment, certain of the strains, over winter. and they then germinate, and again, germinate in inverted commas. A botanist would say that's not the correct terminology, but for you and I, it's easier to understand if we call it that. They germinate in late winter, early spring, and get a jump start on the algae and start to produce and bloom. And I think early this year, somebody sent a photograph from around about March, April, and it looked like that was a sign of bacteria bloom that you had already at that time. Another advantage they have, you'll see in the top left there, we put a little P, that's phosphorus. Phosphorus is less soluble in oxygenated water than it is in deoxygenated water. So what you're going to find is phosphorus levels are much higher at the bottom than they are at the top. The similar thing is at play with nitrogen. Nitrogen is present as nitrate in oxygenated water and as ammonia, which is toxic to fish as well, in the bottom parts. Ammonia is far easier for cyanobacteria to consume and assimilate than nitrates. So you have more nitrogen and phosphorus at the bottom. At the top, algae can only float passively at the top and use what is available there. Cyanobacteria are unique in that a lot of the toxin-producing species are able to control their buoyancy. So they're able to descend to the bottom, load up on the phosphorus and nitrogen and ammonia that is available there at night, and then come up to the top during the day and bloom. So they have these competitive advantages. They have a number of other ones, but I think these are the key ones to understand. Next thing we have to understand is, well, the treatments that we are currently using tend to make the situation worse, not better. But let's understand why that is. Firstly, herbicides. Well, what herbicides do is kill off the weeds. They decompose, die off, deplete oxygen, and add to the sediment nutrient stockpile and the nutrient recycling. The same thing is applicable to algicides. They will kill off everything, the good algae and the cyanobacteria, but the conditions are such that the cyanobacteria are far more able to recover and take advantage of that sort of situation. There are phosphorus precipitants such as alum. Well, what they do is dump the phosphorus into the bottom, depriving the algae that are floating at the top of access to it, but the cyanobacteria can get down to the bottom and access it. The other thing that you have to be wary of is aeration systems, which tend to oxygenate the upper portions of the water. Often they are raised above the bottom of the water and therefore above the sediment, above the bottom, because they don't want to stir it up, because their designs are such that that is what they will do. So it remains anoxic at the bottom. It'll tend to oxygenate the upper portions, and so you just re-establish and entrench in the problem situations of the phosphorus gradient and so on. So that's the whole paradox of treatments, that most of the treatments we've been using are not, they give you a short-term cosmetic relief, but they're not helpful in the long run. So the real thing that we wanted to understand at the Raintree Lakes was the degree of hypoxia and what the situation was with regard to the algae profile. Now, the Government Accountability Office issued a report in June 2022 at the request of Senate and Congress into why is it that despite over 25 years of attempting to manage the risks of hypoxia and harmful algae blooms, the EPA and state agencies have essentially failed to do so. And one of the things that it pointed out was that hypoxia is a critical factor. And hypoxia influences the solubility of nutrients, as I explained earlier. So here's some data taken from a lake. The dotted line shows you the dissolved oxygen in 2021. Along the bottom here is the depth. It's in meters, and you'll see that at about 4.5, 5 meters, which is about 15 feet, the dissolved oxygen level started to drop below 8, below 5, and drop right off. And once you get below 2.5, that is hypoxic. Now, 2 years later, and this is a lake, obviously, we've gone in and fixed the situation. 2 years later, we've got dissolved oxygen maintained all the way down to the bottom. What that does with regard to the nutrient availability is you'll see in 2021, when the dissolved oxygen dropped off at depth, the nutrient levels increased at depth, as I described earlier. So you've got a fantastic nutrient supply down at the bottom where only the cyanobacteria can get to it. Once we have maintained dissolved oxygen levels all the way down to the bottom, the nutrient supply at the bottom for the cyanobacteria gets cut off and their competitive advantages get negated. So to give you some idea, this is Autumn Lake, obviously. And that is the bathymetric scan that we completed in April, I think it was. So we've got a good idea of the depth profile of the lake. Here's another lake that we did. And the reason I'm showing this is to show the impact and the need for biodredging to get rid of that nutrient stockpile. This lake here, this is a 2-foot contour. So the whole north end of the lake, full of sludge and muck, 2 feet deep. 5 years later, we have 5, 6, 7, 8-foot contours up in this area of the lake. We can look at that in cross-section. And again, you'll see at the north end of the lake, we are 2, 3, 4 feet deep. 5 years later, we are 6, 7, 8 feet deep at that same area. So this is the sort of data we want to collect to be able to quantify it. The 5-foot contour in that lake in 2017 looked like that. So anything outside of that contour was less than 5 feet deep. In 2022, you can see how that contour has increased. And in this lake, we've actually increased the amount of water in there by over 50%. So you'll see there, that is the 5-foot contour there. And this is the 5-foot contour now. That whole additional area has been opened up. How does that relate to Autumn Lake? Well, what we do is from that bathymetry, create a chart like this, which allows us to calculate at each depth. So here we're looking at, if you look in the left-hand column, 32 feet deep, 30.7% of the total surface area is encompassed by the 32-foot contour. And 14.6% of the water volume is at 32 feet or deeper. Why that is important is, and that is actually the 30-foot contour, but it gives you an idea pretty much of the surface area of the 32-foot contour. In order to test the hypoxia, measure it, we, in June, came with our DO meters and tested each lake. And this is what we'll see. In Summer Lake, maximum depth is about 10 feet. It became hypoxic at 5 foot of depth. And at 5 foot, that is 28% of the water volume and 48% of the surface area. So 48% of the surface area is hypoxic and potentially recycling nutrients, and 28% of the water volume is hypoxic and animal life are precluded. So that means you're going to have basically a lot of algae and weeds and stuff growing in these shallow areas. Winter Lake is about 20 foot deep maximum. It became hypoxic at 10 feet. That's also about 28% of the water volume, but 64% of the surface area. And there you can see the 10-foot contour. Just by way of reference, Indian Lake in Cuba, which is not too far away from you and was a real mess 3 years ago, when we measured that in August of 2021, it became hypoxic at 21 feet, and that was just 12% of the water volume and 28% of the surface area. But they had a really, really bad cyanobacteria problem. So with that as sort of context, Spring Lake in June became hypoxic at 18 feet, which meant that 32% of the water volume and 50% of the surface area was compromised, hypoxic, and problematic. When we went back in August last week, 8th of August, it was hypoxic at 17 feet, and the water volume there was hypoxia that increased slightly, as had the surface area, but not too much. So that's one parameter, but it is a slight negative. And that is the 18-foot contour at Spring Lake. Autumn Lake in June became hypoxic at 32 feet, which meant 14% of the water volume and 30% of the surface area is hypoxic. The alarming thing is that last week in August, 8th of August, when we went to measure it, became hypoxic at 16 feet, which means now 61% of the surface area and 44% of the water volume is hypoxic. So that's been quite a dramatic change in Autumn Lake. And to give you some idea, that is the 30-foot contour, that's a 15-foot contour. So the degree of hypoxia has increased dramatically. How does that impact the toxic cyanobacteria? So if we go back to this diagram, I explained that algicides are a problem because if you're using them and killing off all the algae in a eutrophic lake where there is a high level of hypoxia and anoxic sediment, you have conditions where the cyanobacteria become far more competitive and they are likely to bounce back and take over. And I mentioned that the Government Accountability Report drew attention to some of these things. It actually specifically calls out copper sulfate that can kill the Hab cells, release the toxins, and the decaying algae cells will cause hypoxia and make the whole situation worse. There's a lot of academic research to back that up. So here's one paper saying that the Microcystis cyanobacteria has a much higher tolerance to copper sulfate compared to a beneficial green algae. And that means that they can endure copper concentrations that are detrimental to the green algae. There's another one saying that the cyanobacteria have a higher tolerance and can survive and even thrive at copper concentrations that are inhibitory to lethal green algae. And then thirdly, this one, and I'll draw your attention particularly to point 3 there, copper-resistant cells of the cyanobacteria are significantly smaller than their non-resistant counterparts. And again, repetitive use of copper sulfate can lead to a proliferation of copper-resistant cyanobacteria. So in essence, this is what we wanted to establish. How far down that journey are we? And so we've been, or the Lake Committee has been taking samples and sending them to a laboratory. This is what the results look like. They tell you how much BG, blue-green, that is cyanobacteria non-toxin producing, and how many Hab cyanobacteria species there are and what sort of volume they are. So you'll see here that we have a small amount. 2% is Hab, but a lot of the cell concentration is cyanobacteria. About 40% of the cells are cyanobacteria, the blue-green, but only about 5 or 10% of the biovolume. What that means, if you've got a lot of cells and a little volume, those cells are much smaller, which is what that research showed, that the smaller cyanobacteria cells are more resistant to copper sulfate. So it would appear we are being drawn into that trap with the copper sulfate treatments. But here, the amounts are not too concerning. If we look at Summer Lake, this was a situation at the beginning of July. Of the total amount of algae, only a small amount was cyanobacteria, non-toxin cyanobacteria, and an even smaller amount was potentially toxin producing. So not a situation for concern. However, by the end of July, the amount of cyanobacteria has significantly increased there, and to the detriment, obviously, of the good green beneficial algae. In winter, not too much of a change, pretty static, slightly worse, but not significant. Spring Lake is of concern. You'll see that in beginning of July, relatively small amount of cyanobacteria. About half of it were potentially toxic and half were not. By the end of the month, the toxin-producing ones have really seemed to have got a good hold on things there. And what is interesting about that is it was already, if you go back and look at it, Spring Lake already had the highest volume that was anoxic and the biggest percentage surface area that was anoxic. But what this indicates is the cyanobacteria have taken advantage of that. This is the Spring Lake data from beginning of July, and you'll see in terms of cell concentration, a lot of blue-green, a little bit of HAB producing, toxin producing. We tend to focus on biovolume rather than cell counts, because cell counts, as I said, there's a lot of small cells here, but in terms of biovolume, the biovolume being produced is relatively small of blue-green. So we tend to focus on biovolume. We think it's a better indicator. But this is Spring Lake at the beginning of July. This is Spring Lake at the end of July. And what you can see is at cell concentration and biovolume, the HAB producing cells have really taken hold and become quite strong. In autumn, this was the situation beginning of July, where the 65–66% of the biovolume was cyanobacteria. The tests in July showed, if anything, a slight improvement. However, we'll be doing tests again in August, and the thing to watch out for there is whether, now that we've seen an increase in the hypoxia and the deoxygenation, whether the cyanobacteria are able to take advantage of that in the same way in Autumn Lake. So basically, spring's got worse, summer's got worse, winter kind of held its own. Spring's got worse. Autumn, at the moment, doesn't look as though it's changed too much as far as the algae profile is concerned, but the warning signs are potentially there. So, the summary is that hypoxia has certainly taken hold. The lakes are severely hypoxic. Cyanobacteria are a real and serious threat. And the next bit of advice that that I would give is that timing is of the essence. And I know there's budgets involved, and I'm not trying to do a pushy sales deal here at all, but to give you some examples of what happened at Indian Lake in Cuba, in 2021, these were the algae tests they did before we began the program. We installed everything in October 2021. But unfortunately, we were held back from starting the program in October. That would have allowed us to oxygenate and treat the lake during winter and suppressed and controlled the cyanobacteria boom and bloom that happens in spring and early summer. To a large extent, because we were unable to use it during commission and begin the system, this is what we began with in May 2022. A massive bloom, which made the job a lot more difficult and a lot more expensive. So we have got it under control. There you'll see the situation. And if we look at it in more detail, you'll see that. So let me just explain what I'm doing here. I'm taking out the 140 million units of biovolume because that is an outlier and it doesn't allow you to see the detail in the other months. So if we take that out and reset, we still have the 35 million, which is what they were at the year before. But it allows us to see this is where the 140 million would have been. It just goes through the roof. We've taken it out so we can look at the detail a bit more granularly. And what you'll see is that June 22 was not an improvement on 21 because things have got so out of hand in May. And July 22 was still not an improvement on 21. It took us until August to get things under control. And that really is why I'm saying that this is where we stand now. measuring 22, 23, 24. So we have got it under control. We've delivered the results, but I would urge you, if at all possible, to start doing something and get things installed this fall, because that's going to make a big difference going into next year. And obviously the using the copper sulfate algicides gives you a short-term cosmetic effect. It looks nice as long as you're using it, but you are paying good money to make the situation worse at the moment and make it more and more difficult and expensive in the long run to fix. Thank you. I just wanted to add that if you go to our website and look right up at the top, we have a section called Simplify the Science. And if you go and have a look at that, there's a more detailed, bit by bit, structured sort of explanation of a lot of the material that I covered in explaining what I've tried to explain today. Thank you.